Proteins are a very diverse group of molecules. What they all have in common, of course, is that they all start as a chain of amino acids that then folds into this very specific three-dimensional shape. But there are many different functions of proteins in the body. So this is a list. I don't want to read the list to you, but I want to just briefly give you an example of each category so you can really see the diversity of these molecules we call proteins. Most proteins in the body are enzymes, and enzymes are probably the most important proteins we'll talk about this semester in some ways. There are really important proteins that are going to be a part of our cell membranes that we'll talk about in more detail later in the semester as well. So enzymes we'll talk about in a lot of detail when we get to the energy unit. And the reason for that is that enzymes are what we call catalysts. Many chemical reactions in the body could not take place without an enzyme. And most of our DNA codes for enzymes. We have a lot of different enzymes that are made. So what we mean by catalysts is they provide the energy necessary to start a chemical reaction. In fact, they reduce the amount of energy input required to start a chemical reaction. And we'll talk about that in more detail again when we get to the energy unit. But it's important to realize right now that enzymes are catalysts, and they're going to be a really important part of our energy unit when we get to that. Okay, storage proteins are our second category of proteins. And a really good example of a storage protein would be a protein called ovalbumin found in egg whites. You've all heard that egg whites are a very excellent source of amino acids, very excellent source of protein for humans. And if you think about it, that egg white that's in an egg, whether it be from a bird or a reptile or an amphibian or a fish, many different organisms lay eggs. And that egg white provides the amino acids for making a whole organism. So if those amino acids are building a whole organism, you can imagine that that's a pretty rich source of protein amino acids for us as well. So those are called storage proteins. Again, that protein is there in a form that those amino acids can get linked together to form whatever structures are needed by that growing, developing organism. Okay, and then we have proteins that form actual structures in the body, and those are called structural proteins. A good example of structural protein would be collagen. Collagen is an important structural protein, and it consists of 3 separate polypeptide chains that are braided together. And collagen makes up our connective tissues, such as tendons, ligaments. Okay, so proteins can actually form structures. We have some important contractile proteins in the body. We're going to have some that are actual motor proteins that can move materials around through the cell, can actually move entire cells. Okay, we're also going to have some important contractile proteins that you've heard of before. Actin and myosin are 2 important contractile proteins that result in our muscles contracting. So muscle contraction is the result of 2 protein fibers that are contractile. We have some important receptor proteins that bind molecules. They bind specific molecules and cause some reaction, some event to take place, either inside the cell, outside the cell, when those specific molecules are bound to the receptor protein. And we'll talk about those in more detail when we get to the cell membrane. Okay, and those go kind of hand in hand with transport proteins that are also often located on cell membranes. Transport proteins allow molecules to move in and out of the cell if they recognize that molecule, if that molecule can bind. We also have some important transport proteins that are not in the cell membrane. They're actually part of our red blood cells called hemoglobin that carry H2O, they carry oxygen and carbon dioxide for the red blood cell. Okay, so transport proteins, some are embedded in the plasma membrane of our cells, and they allow molecules to move in and out of the cell. Rattly board. Okay, then we have some hormones that are proteins. We've talked about lipid-based hormones. So remember, estrogen and testosterone are hormones, but they're actually lipid-based. But we've also talked already about two protein-based hormones, namely insulin and glucagon. What was I on? 6? Okay, 7. We have some proteins that are hormones. And again, insulin and glucagon produced by the cells of the pancreas help control our blood glucose levels, as we talked about in the carbohydrate lecture. Those are protein-based hormones. Okay, and then the last category, defensive proteins, part of our immune system. We have some really important proteins you've heard of called antibodies. And we'll talk more specifically about how antibodies work later in the semester. They basically bind a foreign cell or a foreign particle and keep it from entering your cell. So you can see this is a very diverse list of different categories of proteins. And so you should just be familiar with a couple of examples, a few examples from this list of the different kinds of proteins. Again, enzymes are the most numerous, and enzymes are going to be very important when we talk about energy. So first I want to start by talking about the amino acids. So remember that little chart we made that had the monomers and polymers for all the macromolecules? Remember, the monomers of proteins are called amino acids. Okay, and then the polymer is a chain of those amino acids called a polypeptide. It's also called a polypeptide chain. I like this term, polypeptide chain, because it really is a chain of amino acids. And we have 20 different amino acids that can make up that chain. And those amino acids are what is going to ultimately result in the three-dimensional shape of that protein. Because these amino acids, when they get all in a line, are going to start reacting with each other. And it's the reaction among those amino acids that's going to result in how that protein folds into its final three-dimensional shape. So let's look at just the general structure of an amino acid. So this is an amino acid on the board. They all have a similar structure except in one location. Okay, so they all have this central carbon. It's referred to as the alpha carbon. A hydrogen. Okay, then two functional groups that we've talked about previously. We've seen this carboxyl group before. Where have we seen this carboxyl group? What other type of macromolecule had a carboxyl group? It was the lipids. Remember, fatty acids have a carboxyl group. But now we're seeing a new functional group. We saw it when we talked about the functional groups, but now we're seeing it on a macromolecule. It's known as the amino group. Remember, whenever you see amine, it's referring to nitrogen. Okay, so this is our amino group. Every amino acid has a carboxyl group and an amino group. And when we get them all in a chain, this polypeptide chain is going to have an amino end and a carboxyl end to that chain as these amino acids link together. Okay, then all 20 amino acids differ only in one location, and that is called the R group. Okay, so all 20 amino acids have the same structure except at the R group. That R group is where all 20 differ in structure. You do not need to memorize the structure of all 20 amino acids. You do need to know this basic structure. You need to recognize this as an amino acid when it's by itself, and as a polypeptide chain when we link them all together. And you need to recognize that they all differ in one location at the R group. So these are our 20 amino acids. And you can see that our group ranges from just a hydrogen on glycine and can get pretty complex, as you see in some of these amino acids. So this would be the R group on every single one of these 20 amino acids. And that R group gives each amino acid its specific chemical properties. Okay, so R groups give the amino acids their specific chemical properties. You can see, for example, that we have polar amino acids. Okay, so if they're polar, then they're hydrophilic, water-loving amino acids. We have some that are nonpolar or hydrophobic. We have some that are electrically charged. And that is what's going to ultimately result in the three-dimensional shape of that protein. When you get these guys all in a line, those R groups are going to start reacting with each other. Okay, some of them might hydrogen bond with each other. Some of them might ionically bond. The hydrophobic ones are going to tuck inside so that they're away from the water. So that chain of amino acids is what results in the final three-dimensional shape of that protein. So results in 3D shape of the protein. And we'll talk about that in the lecture where we talk about the 4 levels of protein structure. Okay, so this is just a close-up. These would be the nonpolar, hydrophobic. These are the hydrophilic, electrically charged. Again, you don't need to memorize the specific structure of all 20, but you do need to know the basic structure. You just don't need to memorize the R groups individually. You also need to be aware that when we write LYS, that represents lysine. You don't need to memorize the abbreviations necessarily. You just need to be aware that each of the amino acids has a 3-letter abbreviation. And that's going to be relevant when we start talking about protein translation later in the semester. So this is how we link the amino acids together to form that polypeptide. So remember, to link any monomers together, we remove water, and that's called dehydration reaction. Okay, so when we say we remove water, it's going to be a hydroxyl group from this carboxyl and a hydrogen from this amino group. Once we remove that water, now those two can link together. And that covalent bond that links the amino acids together is called a peptide bond. You don't need to know that specific term. Just know that's a covalent bond that's going to link those two together. So this is how we form that amino acid chain called the polypeptide. And you can see that there's still an amino end and there's still a carboxyl end, just like I mentioned previously. Okay, so every protein ends up having a very specific three-dimensional shape. Okay, so it's starting out as a chain of amino acids, but as soon as we get that last amino acid connected to the chain, that protein is going to form into a very specific three-dimensional shape. So now we're going to talk about protein structure in more detail and the specifics of how this happens.